That's the sound of me opening or reopening the door to 17 Bruce Street. So welcome to my presentation in slow time genealogy. Now, I don't know about you, but I have two modes when I'm doing family history. One is my tree building mode, in which I'm rushing about hither and thither, gathering new ancestors. The other is the family story focus, where I go really slow time. I look anew at the records I found, and I see what else I can learn about my ancestors' lives just from the simple records that we normally use. And that's what we're going to do today. So, will this slow time approach add many more ancestors to your family tree? No, probably not. Will it really help you learn more about your ancestors' lives? Yes, if like me, you just have dashed past the records in the first instance and not looked at them thoroughly, then it most definitely will do. So, what was it that made me want to look at 17 Bruce Street? Well, 17 Bruce Street was the one-time home of my great-grandfather, John Macpherson. And you can see him here, the wee lad at the front with those chubby cheeks. He must be the apple of his family's eye. There's his older siblings in the background and his mum and dad, one on each side of him. So, in our family, we know John as an older man. John is the one who served at Gallipoli. John is the one that, even though he was an ambulance man in the First World War, which must have been a really tough job, to say the least, he managed to draw humorous cartoons, which he sent back to his sister, Nellie. You can see there a photo of her in the middle. He's also the one who was much loved, like his two daughters loved him, and his wife, you can see her there as an older woman. She gave up everything after the First World War, even getting written out of her father's will, and sailed off across the ocean to marry him in South America. So he's a hardworking, much loved kind of person. The war stories about him were kind of something that we all knew, and there's something that I'd written about and to share with my family. And these are just little examples of a few of the things I found. But the war stories are just only part of our ancestors' lives, aren't they? I've done a timeline here just as a quick visual aid. We have him born in 1888 and he died in 1951. And that red marker there, kind of, in the kind of middle, early part of it, those are the kind of 4 or 5 years during which he served in the First World War. I put together a timeline of his later years after the red block, but what about that early period, that early third of his life? I'm ashamed to say I didn't know much about it. So I thought, let's find out about John Macpherson's childhood, where he lived. And he happened to live at 17 Bruce Street. So to get a feel for the area, I looked it up on Google Street View, and it's a substantial building. It's got 12 windows at the front, 6 windows on each side of the front door, and it's 3 stories high. And here's John, age 3. So in that pink arrow, halfway down the page, on the left-hand side is John, age 3, with his family. But of course, it's the typical story. That family isn't the only one to live in this big home. The family of 6 live there, but you can see also in the left-hand column, there are several other houses living at 17 Bruce Street. And if you go on to the previous page, there are 2 more households. If we look over on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see that in the column which says rooms with one or more windows, I hope my video isn't covering over that bit. Anyway, that far column, that's what it says, is rooms with 1 or more windows. You can see that pretty much most of the homes, they have 3 windows. At least John's family, they live in a home with 3 windows that have 1 or more windows. So John's childhood was, he was a little boy in a busy Victorian multiple occupancy home. On a mission to learn more about what that home might have been like, I thought, right, let's draw up a spreadsheet. I love a spreadsheet, and find out who else is living there. And there were, in the 6 families who lived at 17 Bruce Street, there were 31 people. I found it interesting to note that out of the adults, the only adult who'd been born in Stirling was John's father, William Macpherson. All of the other adults had been born elsewhere and presumably moved to Stirling for work. Out of the other residents, looking at their ages, out of the 31 residents, there were 14 who were aged 10 or younger. So even under the fierce glare of really strict Victorian parenting, it's got to have been a pretty rowdy, busy house to live in. I think that's probably where John got his sense of fun and liveliness from. That's what I like to think anyway. So to learn a little bit more about the house, I thought, let's look through the newspapers. And I was lucky to chance upon this discovery. And there's a little entry in an 1883 edition of the Stirling Observer. And the family had already lived there for a couple of years. And so this is one of the other flats, 17, being let out. And you can see it comprises 2 rooms and a kitchen. So that's probably those 3 rooms that have 1 or more windows. It also has a scullery, WC, and a garden. So obviously it's going to be shared access to the same garden, I assume. Also, reading around to learn about it, I kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole into learning about Victorian ranges. So we're going to be talking the Victorian period. Most people would have had a coal-fired range. Obviously, it's good for cooking. It's also good for drying clothes, heating the home. And they didn't have thermometers, apparently. So in order to test whether your range was of a suitable heat for cooking, you put a piece of paper in the range. When it turned yellow, you were good to go. It could start baking. Anyway, to put this home in context, I thought let's have a look at a map. So obviously with the National Library of Scotland collections of maps online, which do span many other places apart from Scotland, we are in for a treat, aren't we? We've got the Ordnance Survey maps. And here's one from the 1890s, 25 inches to the mile, so lots of lovely detail. We can see Bruce Street, and I've marked a little heart. It's kind of in the middle of the screen, quite near the bottom. So Bruce Street is the 3rd house. So number 17 is the 3rd house down Bruce Street. It's the 2nd front door because the other house on the corner, their front door's around the corner, and it's still the same today. Now, when we look down the street on Google Street View, we can see that actually it's continuous buildings. But at the time John lived there, it was very much a work in progress, probably a bit of a building site. So the building which was opposite number 17 wasn't actually erected until 1901. You can tell that because there's a handy date a date brick on the front. Another of the buildings down the street has a date of 1892. So it was very much a work in progress. And I can really imagine the little John on this busy Bruce Street with builders working probably over all the years that he was living there, gradually building further buildings, toddling about, completely absorbed and getting a chance to kind of stare at what they were doing. If he's anything like my own little grandson, who's obsessed with anything to do with building and machinery. Looking a little further, wider apart, you can see the engine sheds. Now, that's not that far away. So he would have heard the clank of the trains. He would have probably wanted to go and have a look at the engine sheds. So that was what my project was about. It was trying to get a feel, what would this Stirling in the 1890s have looked like to young John, to a young boy? What would his boyhood experiences have been like? So I thought, okay, what else would the children like? Well, toy shops, cookies, biscuits and bakes and things like that. So I explored the trade directories to find out about the toy shops and the bakeries and places of interest. So I did plot the toy shops. There's only 4 of them showing here, but I plotted the toy shops, and there were 6 toy shops in Stirling in the 1897 edition of Cook and Wiley's Trade Directory. And they're all kind of very much in the centre of town. So this is Bruce Street is right at the top of this screen, kind of a little bit off the page. But the centre of town was where it was all happening, and around King Street, that was kind of where people would have their showstopper version of their shops. The red circles, those are 3 of the 4 branches of the co-op that were in existence in Stirling at the time. And the co-op has a particular family interest to me because John's father, William, was the secretary of the Stirling Co-op. So, maybe the little boy, John, maybe he got taken by his mum sometimes to go and see dad at work or pick him up after work. Or maybe as he got older, he'd go and meet his dad after work and they'd wander through the streets of Stirling home. Who knows? Peeping over on the right-hand side of the map, we can see the river. And of course, this is the Forth. And Stirling was a really bustling harbour still at the time with cargo coming from international places. So I imagine too that the harbour with the comings and goings of the vessels must have been another place that John really enjoyed visiting, perhaps imagining that one day he too would go on a boat, which of course he did, to serve in the First World War, but also as he travelled the globe working in the wine industry, which he did both before and after the First World War. This is a little bit of a close-up to see the location of some of the co-ops and the toy shops. And this is a little aside, but I think things like this are potentially things which could interest other family members because they like the idea of trying to think what our ancestors' lives are actually like, and it's kind of a bit less data led, and it's a bit more imaginative, maybe, for capturing their imagination. So I did go down a bit of a rabbit hole because, as well as thinking, what he might have liked looking at, I also wanted to get a feel for what the practicalities of his life would have been like, and also what the practicalities of his mother Elizabeth's life would have been, living in that flat. So what were the utilities in Stirling through the Victorian period? Well, I found out that gas street lighting came to Stirling in 1826. Didn't really get electricity. I think it was 1901 I found that electricity came to Stirling. So there's a big long gap. After the cholera outbreaks all across England and Scotland, British Isles through the 1830s, then many municipal areas made a massive effort to clean up their water supplies, and Stirling was just one of these places that did that as well. So you can see from the 1850s, really improved water supplies. And I was fascinated to learn that people only had access to water, running water, for a few hours a day. So this is something that we would find, an extreme drama. It would be on the local news that the water had been turned off and people only had access for a few hours a day. But this was the norm. Those early water suppliers, of whom I think before the nationalisation of water in Scotland, just after the Second World War, I think there were more than 200 different water suppliers, and it was the norm that definitely through the 1800s, the latter half of the 1800s, that you'd only have water for a few hours a day. So if you were at work during that time and didn't get access to your water, then you just had to wait till the next day. Scrolling on across the timeline, thinking about phones and cars, those things which are just totally commonplace today. But looking through old photos of Stirling, I can't find any evidence of cars until we get to the early 1900s. I think it was 1901 again. Phones, there's scant evidence of phones too. By the time you get to the 1903, 1904 phone books, then there are 60 people listed in the phone book for Stirling, and that's out of a population of about 18,000 people. So phones are still a massive rarity. And I think the idea of the phones in the cars, that would have made such a difference to the soundscape that John experienced. His boyhood would have been the clip-clop of horses, and it would have been actual people shouting out letters through letterboxes. That's how you communicated. The phone was still a thing of the future. Scrolling back to the records and drilling back again into 17 Bruce Street, I thought, right, let's have a look at the valuation rolls, because these are just fabulous records, both for finding out about owners and occupiers of properties in Scotland. And this is where I found it got really interesting, because I wasn't just finding my ancestors there as tenants, which is what I'd assumed when I found them in a multiple occupancy property. I actually found that I had many relations all working together to kind of acquire this property. So we read here, we have John Williamson of Crieff, and we have James Macpherson, and that's on owning half of 17 Bruce Street. And the line below, we have William Macpherson and James Macpherson owning another half of 17 Bruce Street. And then when we go through, this is for the 1905, 1906 valuation rolls. When we look at earlier editions of the valuation rolls, we find that some of those family members, those are all family members there on the left-hand side being owners, they were tenants, and some of the other ones were owners. When we go on to 1914, 1915, I was particularly pleased to see my Aunt Nellie. There she is, Miss Helen Macpherson. So the girls are getting a look in, and she's there in the proprietor column. And her brother is owning half of 17 Bruce Street, and she's owning the other half. So it wasn't kind of bank of mum and dad, it was much more like a bank of family, and they were all chipping in, sometimes being tenants, sometimes getting kind of improving themselves, if you like, or managing to acquire the money and earn the money to buy the property, and they kind of shared it and all worked together. So I kind of love that collaborative vibe. And this is just a little excerpt from my tree, and all those people with arrows next to them, they were all involved in owning or living at 17 Bruce Street. And there were many other people, family members obviously, who lived there as well, but they didn't ever make it to the valuation records. So when I started out, John was the one who served at Gallipoli, and I knew about his adult life as I had outlined, but I knew really little about his childhood. And by kind of rummaging around those really familiar records, the ones that we can readily find online, the maps, the trade directories, the phone books, the valuation records, then I feel that I've managed to provide myself with some context for his life. I haven't got certainties about what he actually did and whether he really did go and squash his nose up against the glass of a bakery and just dream of having a gingerbread man. But I do feel as though I've verified some of those nebulous aspects of my family, like from the family stories and the things I did know. I had a sense of a hardworking, fun-loving, loving and lovable man. And what I found out about his family with those connections with the property owning and letting at 17 Bruce Street, and the way the family continue to be in such good contact with each other all through their lives, I feel as though I really have learnt a little bit more about that boy, John Macpherson, back in the late Victorian times in Stirling. So I hope you enjoyed my kind of whistle stop rabbit hole lurch around. I like to think of it as a research project because that makes me feel better about the many, many hours I've spent meandering the web to try and piece together a feel for his childhood. So, in my day job, I'm editor of Family Tree, and within Family Tree, which is the monthly magazine, we have all sorts of wonderful experts who teach us all sorts of skills to help us get better and more thorough and more accurate with our family history research. And in the September issue, we've got lots and lots of articles which will help people gain ideas about how to trace their places. And as a special All About That Place offer, if you go to family-tree.co.uk/place-offer, then you can sign up to our free e-newsletter and we'll send you for free a digital copy of the September issue of Family Tree. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening then. Bye-bye.